There was a moment in Britain, somewhere between the swagger of the Beatles and the grit of the 70s, when a single car parked outside a pub could stop a whole street. Men leaned against fences just to look at it. Teenagers saved wages for a year just to sit behind its wheel once. That car was the Ford Capri. And here's the strange part. A car this loved, this wanted, this woven into the identity of a whole generation of British working men, Ford killed it, quietly, deliberately, no grand farewell. Just a factory that stopped turning it out one day in 1986. So the question that's been sitting unanswered for decades is simple. If everyone wanted it so badly, why did the company that built it decide it had to die? To understand that ending, you have to go back to where it started, because the beginning of this story is stranger than most people realize. It's the mid-1960s, and Ford's American division has just struck gold with the Mustang, a car built for the everyday man who wanted to feel like a racing driver on his way to the office. Over in Europe, Ford's German and British teams were watching that success with envy. They didn't have anything like it, so they were given a brief, and the brief was blunt. Build something that captures that same hunger, but for European roads, European wallets, European men. Design work began in 1965, and it wasn't a small gamble either. Ford poured £20 million into the project, an enormous sum for the era, money that had to be justified with sales, not sentiment. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about. The car wasn't supposed to be called Capri at all. Ford had already chosen a name, Colt, a nod to the Mustang bloodline it was inspired by. Prototypes were built under that name. Marketing had already started shaping a message around it. And then Ford ended up in court, going head-to-head with Mitsubishi over the rights to that exact word. Ford lost. Just months before the public unveiling, the entire naming strategy had to be scrapped and rebuilt from nothing. Under pressure, with the clock ticking toward a motor show deadline, the car was renamed Capri, and it made its first public appearance under that name at the Brussels Motor Show in 1969. Nobody in that crowd had any idea the name on the badge had almost been something completely different. And there's a quieter, sadder story hiding behind the shape of the car itself. The man who actually penned the Capri's silhouette was an American designer named Philip Clark, working inside Ford's British studio under the design leadership of Roy Haynes. Clark had already made his mark on the industry once before. He was one of the people responsible for shaping the original Mustang, the very car the Capri was built to answer. But for decades, credit for the Capri's design went almost entirely unrecognized, and Clark himself never got to see how far his second great car would go. He died at just 32 years old, from kidney failure, before the Capri had even finished its production run, and it was only much later that automotive historians properly traced the Capri's lines back to his hand. The man who helped invent two of the most emotionally loaded cars of the 20th century never lived to hear either of them called an icon. What happened next surprised even Ford. In its first 2 years alone, the Capri sold roughly 400,000 units, a pace that stunned an industry used to slower, safer growth curves. Ford's advertising leaned hard into aspiration, selling it with a line that stuck in the national memory: "The car you always promised yourself." That single sentence did something clever. It didn't sell horsepower, it sold identity. It told a young factory worker or a junior office clerk that this car was proof he'd made it, even if just a little. And it worked, because by the time production wound down years later, almost 1.9 million Capris had rolled off the line worldwide. Now, before we go further into how this car earned its place in the culture and how it eventually fell apart, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to dig up the real, research stories behind the machines that shaped your generation. No fluff, no guesses, just the facts. Most people never bothered to find out. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And if something in this story hits home, drop it in the comments. Tell us what you remember, because these stories are always better with your memories attached. The Capri didn't just sell well. It burrowed into the culture in a way few cars manage. It became the car driven by the tough, streetwise characters on British television screens through the 70s and 80s, the kind of men audiences wanted to be. It wasn't a luxury car. It wasn't pretending to be European royalty like some of its rivals. It was a working man's fantasy machine, priced so a regular family could stretch for it, styled so it looked like it belonged to someone far richer. That gap between what it cost and what it looked like it cost was the entire secret of its appeal. But under the bonnet, the early years weren't without their problems, and this is where the story gets a little less glamorous. The first generation, Capri used a dynamo rather than a modern alternator to keep its electrical system charged, and dynamos of that era were notoriously unreliable, especially at low engine speeds in stop-start city driving. Owners dealt with flickering lights, weak batteries, and cars that occasionally refused to start on cold mornings. Ford knew this was a problem. So when the second generation arrived, they quietly swapped in a proper alternator, a fix so basic it's almost funny that it took a full redesign to make it standard. It's a small detail, but it says something bigger. Even while riding a wave of success, the Capri was never a perfect machine. It was a compromise, built fast, built to a budget, and it showed in ways the marketing never mentioned. As the 1970s rolled into the 80s, the engine lineup kept shifting too, and not always in the direction fans wanted. The big 3-liter V6, the version enthusiasts genuinely loved for its power and its growl, was discontinued in the early 80s and replaced with a smaller, fuel-injected 2.8-liter version. On paper, it sounds like an upgrade. In practice, it was Ford quietly admitting that the era of cheap, thirsty, big-engine performance cars was ending, and the company was trimming the Capri down to survive rising fuel costs and tightening regulations. The car that had once represented pure, unapologetic ambition was slowly being downsized, engine by engine, badge by badge. Now here's where the story turns from bittersweet to almost brutal, because the thing that finally killed the Capri wasn't a scandal, and it wasn't bad engineering. It was timing. In the early 1980s, a new kind of car exploded onto European roads, small, nimble, front-wheel drive hatchbacks that were cheaper to buy, cheaper to run, and just as much fun to drive fast. Enthusiasts and industry writers came to call this shift the hot hatch revolution, and it rewired what an entire generation wanted from an affordable performance car. Suddenly, a long-bonneted, rear-wheel drive coupe with a big thirsty engine up front looked like something from a different era, entirely, heavy, old-fashioned, and expensive to insure and fuel compared to the new wave. The Capri hadn't gotten worse. The world around it had simply moved on, and moved fast. And here's the part that stings the most if you actually love this car. By its final years on sale, most of the people buying a brand new Capri weren't buying it because it was still the best choice on the market. They were buying it out of loyalty, out of nostalgia, because it reminded them of being young, of being someone who mattered on a Friday night. Ford's own engineers and executives understood this. Sales figures don't lie, and the numbers were quietly falling, year after year, even while die-hard fans kept a small flame alive. A car built to represent ambition had become a car people bought to relive the past. There's one more detail that rarely gets mentioned, and it's a physical one, not an emotional one. These cars rusted badly. The steel and the protective coatings used at the time simply weren't built to survive decades of wet British winters and salted roads, and that's exactly why genuine, rust-free, original Capris are so rare and so valuable today. Many were quietly lost to scrapyards long before anyone thought to call them classics. The very thing that made the survivors so precious now is the same flaw that helped bury thousands of them decades ago. By 1986, with sales no longer justifying the tooling costs, with a market that had permanently shifted towards smaller hot hatches, and with a design that hadn't fundamentally evolved in years, Ford made its decision. Production stopped. No dramatic press conference. No emotional send-off. Just under 1.9 million units built across its entire run, and then silence. But the ending had actually been creeping up for years before that final day. British production itself quietly stopped a full decade earlier, in October of 1976, at which point Ford consolidated all Capri manufacturing into its Cologne plant in Germany, meaning the last 10 years of Capris bought by British drivers weren't built in Britain at all, and when the very end finally came, Ford didn't just let the line stop cold. They marked it with one last special edition, painted in a distinctive Brooklands green, of which just over 1,000 were built in 1986 alone. Enthusiasts and the press nicknamed it the Farewell Capri, and it remains, to this day, the single most sought-after version for collectors precisely because everyone involved in building it already knew it was the last one. Even more telling, Ford never gave the Capri a direct successor, not that year, not the year after. To this day, the format it invented, the affordable, aspirational coupe for the ordinary man, has never really been replaced inside Ford's lineup in the same spirit. When the Capri name did resurface decades later, it came back as an all-electric family SUV, sharing a drivetrain with an entirely different Ford model and priced well north of £40,000. The reaction from people who remembered the original was swift and, frankly, brutal. Owners' clubs and lifelong enthusiasts openly said online that whatever this new machine was, it had no right to wear that badge. It wasn't a two-door coupe. It wasn't affordable. It wasn't built for a young man chasing a dream car on a modest wage. It was a tall, practical family vehicle, borrowing a legendary name to sell a very different kind of promise. Ford's own marketing team expected backlash and got it anyway. Same name, completely different, soul. But to really understand why the Capri mattered so much to Britain, you have to look past the showroom entirely and onto the racetrack, because this is where the car earned respect that no advertising budget could buy. Ford didn't just build a stylish shell and call it a day. They built performance versions, badged with the letters RS, engineered for drivers who wanted something closer to a genuine sports car than a dressed-up family runabout. These RS Capris were raced in touring car championships across Europe throughout the 1970s, going wheel to wheel against far more expensive machinery, and, on plenty of weekends, beating it. For a working man watching from the grandstand, that mattered enormously. It meant the car sitting in his own driveway shared its bones, its engineering, its DNA, with something winning trophies on live television. That connection between the ordinary and the extraordinary is exactly what turned a good sales figure into genuine devotion. The clearest proof of that came in the fight against BMW. Through 1973 and 1974, Ford's competition department in Cologne went head-to-head with BMW's factory team in the European Touring Car Championship, and it turned into one of the most personal rivalries of the era. To keep pace, Ford built a genuine homologation special, a road-legal version fitted with a bigger 3.1-liter engine, produced only in the numbers required to qualify it for racing. Just 250 of these cars were ever built, all of them right-hand drive, all of them assembled at Ford's Halewood plant, and Ford even brought in the recently retired Formula One world champion Jackie Stewart to pose for the publicity photos announcing it. On track, the fully developed racing version of that car, tuned far beyond anything sold to the public, produced well over 400 horsepower, and it carried some of the biggest names in motorsport behind the wheel that season, drivers like Jochen Mass, Niki Lauda, and Jackie Ickx. In 1974, that Capri claimed victories at the Nürburgring, at Zandvoort, and at Jarama, beating factory-backed rivals that cost several times as much to build. Ford didn't win the overall championship that year. BMW edged them out by the narrowest of margins, but the message had already landed. This wasn't just the car you always promised yourself anymore. On certain weekends, it was the fastest thing on the road, full stop. There's another layer to this story that rarely gets mentioned outside serious car circles, and it involves the Capri's strange double life across the Atlantic. Ford didn't just sell this car under its own badge. In the United States, a version of the Capri was sold through Ford's Mercury division, aimed at American buyers who wanted something smaller and sportier than the typical land yacht sedans dominating dealership lots at the time. The details differed generation to generation, the badges changed, The engines were tuned for American tastes and American fuel, but the underlying idea stayed remarkably consistent. This was supposed to be an accessible European alternative to the pony cars that had defined the previous decade. It never became the phenomenon in America that it was in Britain, but it quietly built its own small, loyal following. Proof that the appeal Ford tapped into wasn't only a British thing, it was universal. People everywhere wanted to feel like they were driving something a little bit dangerous, a little bit glamorous, without needing a fortune to do it. And that brings us to money, because the way this car's value has moved over the decades tells its own quiet story about regret. When the first Capri launched in 1969, it cost roughly £890, a genuinely accessible price for a young working man willing to save for it, equivalent to somewhere around £14,000 in today's terms. Fast forward to now, and a well-preserved, original example, especially one of the rarer performance variants, can fetch anywhere from £14,000 on the low end to well over £40,000 for the most desirable models. Think about what that means. The very same car Ford decided wasn't worth building anymore is now, in its surviving original form, worth more, adjusted for the era, than it ever was new. So why does any of this actually matter to you, watching this today? Because this isn't really a story about a car. It's a story about how easily something can be loved by millions and still get thrown away the moment it stops fitting a spreadsheet. The Capri wasn't killed because people stopped wanting it. It was killed because the people making the decisions decided loyalty and nostalgia weren't the same thing as profit. It's also worth understanding just how much this car physically changed across its lifetime. Because the Capri that rolled off the line in its final year barely resembled the one that stunned crowds at that Brussels debut. The original design, penned in the mid-60s, gave it a long bonnet, a short tail, and fake air vents pressed into the rear wings, purely for looks. By the time the second generation arrived, Ford had reworked the body into a practical hatchback rather than a traditional boot. The third generation brought a dramatically reworked nose, sharper, lower, more aggressive. The range underneath that bodywork was just as wide as the styling suggested. At the entry level sat a modest 1.3-liter four-cylinder engine, cheap to insure and cheap to run, aimed squarely at buyers who wanted the look without the running costs of anything faster. Above that sat 1.6 and 2-liter versions, and at the very top, the 6-cylinder cars, first the 3-liter Essex V6 and later, after emissions and fuel rules tightened, the smaller 2.8-liter fuel-injected V6. Trim names told their own story too, from the everyday L and good luck models, through to the sportier GT, and finally the plush, leather-trimmed gear at the top. Proof that Ford wanted this one car to be believable as a first car for a young apprentice and a status symbol for his manager, sold off the very same showroom floor. And it's worth remembering that this wasn't only a British success story squeezed out by circumstance. For most of its life, the Capri was manufactured in Germany, in the city of Cologne, even as it became so deeply associated with British identity that most people assumed it was built on British soil from beginning to end. A car so thoroughly woven into the British working man's sense of self was, for much of its production run, rolling off a German assembly line, engineered by a joint German and British team who never set out to build a national icon. Everything else, the loyalty, the nostalgia, the grief when it finally disappeared, that was earned along the way, not planned from the boardroom. Think about how quietly it all happened. There was no scandal to point at, no single failure you could blame. Just a slow accumulation of small decisions, a fuel crisis that changed what people valued, a new generation of cheaper cars that made an old formula look outdated, and a company that, in the end, chose to protect its balance sheet rather than its legacy. That memory is real. It happened. And no accountant's decision decades later can take it away from you. That's really the heart of this one. Ford built something extraordinary almost by accident, chasing an American idea with a European budget, and it turned into one of the defining cars of an entire generation of British life. And then, when the numbers stopped adding up, they let it go without ceremony. If there's a lesson buried in that, it's this. Don't wait for the people in charge to decide something you love is worth preserving. If it matters to you, say so. Remember it out loud. Pass it on to someone younger who never got to see it in its prime. Because the Capri proves that popularity alone was never enough to guarantee survival, and it won't be enough for the next beloved thing either, unless people like you keep the memory breathing. If this story took you back, even for a moment, to a Friday night, a first car, a father or an uncle who swore by his Capri, do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, because there are dozens more stories like this waiting to be told properly, with real research and real respect for the people who lived them. Drop a comment and tell us what you remember most from this one, whether it's the naming battle with Mitsubishi, the rust that claimed so many of these cars, or simply the sound of that six-cylinder engine pulling away from a light. Hit like if this brought something back for you, and if you know someone who'd remember this car the way you do, send it to them.